Okay, so let's take a look at Bonnie Steinbock's view, or her essay on adultery, and see what her arguments are in that regard. So basically, she's going to conclude, just kind of jumping to the end, that adultery is not morally wrong. Although I think the term adultery is a little misleading. I think non-monogamy, because adultery builds in, you think of as deception when you think of adultery, but that's not what she's talking about. She's talking about non-monogamous relationships. So she's going to conclude that non-monogamous relationships, even marriages, non-monogamous marriages are not morally wrong, but she's also going to suggest that traditional marriages are not morally wrong either. So one perspective you could take on monogamy is that it's completely wrong, it's backwards, it's just this traditional religious value. We have no reason to value monogamy whatsoever going forward into the future. From a rational perspective, there's no reason to value monogamy. She doesn't take that approach. She says, well, we can value monogamy. Monogamy can be one sort of conception of a good life, and there are good reasons to value this conception, to think this is a good conception of what a good life consists of. But conceptions of the good life are varied, right? So there's not only one possible good life. Not all people are the same. For some people, a good life involves living a quiet life in the country. For some people, a good life might be living in New York City. It's not necessarily, one isn't necessarily better than the other. People are different. There's room in moral thinking for different conceptions of the good life, right? So she's saying that there's monogamy is one possible conception of a good life, one reasonable, one rational conception, but non-monogamy is also a rational conception of a good life. Okay, so that's her basic conclusion. Let's see exactly how she gets there, some of the arguments she makes along the way. So she starts off by noting that according to a survey in Cosmopolitan, 54% of American wives have had extramarital affairs. According to a survey in Redbook magazine, 40% of women over 40 have had extramarital affairs. I saw a headline not too long ago that for the first time in history, women are having as many affairs as men. So that's an interesting take on gender equality. So I think the point of this, and these things it's hard to get good statistics on these topics. But the point is, I think, that adultery is very common, right? It's very, very common. No matter how you think about it, adultery, no matter what, whether the statistics are off by a little, and usually, or off by, they can't, a lot of people have sex outside of marriage, but a lot of people also disapprove of adultery. So, disapprove of sex outside marriage. So what do we do about this sort of situation? It's a moral question, right? We tend to disapprove of adultery as a society, but as a society, we engage in it fairly commonly. How do we resolve this tension, right? So maybe we're just wrong about our sort of views on adultery, right? So one argument she looks at is the idea that adultery is different from things like murder, theft, and lying. So murder, theft, and lying are universally prohibited by all cultures. Society can't function if you allow those things, but adultery is different. Society can function if you allow adultery. Most cultures do have various sort of ways of allowing for adultery or encouraging it even traditionally in various forms. So she says adultery isn't like these other moral issues, so there's good reason to think it's not, it's a different kind of thing. Then she looks at this question of, well, maybe it's not a public criminal matter, so it's obviously not criminally wrong like these other things are. There's a very important difference, but maybe it's an important moral rule. And you could think about things like pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, as being sort of relevant to why adultery is wrong. But she says, if those are good arguments against adultery, they're also good arguments against dating, sex before marriage, things like that. And most people don't think those are wrong. So what do we do about that? Okay, so she says there's two reasons for considering adultery immoral. One is that adultery is promise-breaking, and the other is that it involves deception. Pretty much everyone agrees deception is wrong, promise-breaking is wrong. But what about an open marriage? So an open marriage is the idea that people are open their marriage is open to other sexual relationships, right? And this is something which partners can choose to pursue. They're upfront about this when they get together. They make that choice together to be in an open relationship. Okay, so if the primary objection to adultery is that it involves deception or promise breaking, what if there's no deception involved? Does that make adultery? On what possible grounds could adultery be morally wrong? Okay, so she says if an open marriage has been freely chosen by both spouses and not imposed by a dominant on a dependent partner, would such an arrangement be morally acceptable or even desirable? The attractiveness of extramarital affairs without dishonesty, disloyalty, or guilt should not be downplayed. However satisfying sex between married people may be, it cannot have the excitement of a new relationship. And then she raises an interesting point. She says perhaps the expectation of sexual exclusivity in marriage stems from emotions which are not admirable, jealousy and possessiveness. That most people experience these feelings is no reason for applauding them or institutionalizing them. So maybe our traditional prohibitions against adultery are based on emotions that are not positive moral emotions, jealousy, controllingness, right? So traditionally, most societies, men could have adultery, women could not. Women were seen as the property of men. So there's a good reason to think our current standards, our beliefs around adultery stem back to this idea of women being property, and if a man has sex with another man's woman, he's like stealing that man's property. Those were common views, things like that. So maybe this is something we need to sort of, it's like a kind of selfishness, a kind of sort of immaturity that we just need to grow up about and realize that these are negative emotions, not positive emotions. So that's an interesting possibility. So she says also in a good marriage, partners can enjoy different activities, travel apart, have separate friends. Why draw the line of sexual activity? So if you can have different friends in a marriage, why can't you have different sexual partners? Now, sexual partners, sexual emotions are obviously much more intense than friendship emotions, so that you might think that threatens the stability of the institution of marriage, right? Although you could take the other tack and say, well, the institution of marriage isn't doing very well, we could do, maybe this will improve marriages, right? Maybe people will be more likely to stay together rather than separating or divorcing if they can have sex with other people. So that's a interesting empirical question. Would marriages be more stable if people were allowed to have sexual partners outside marriage? Divorce rate's very high at this point in time. Okay. So basically she says, well, the natural response to this is that sex is an expression of affection and intimacy, and so should be reserved for people who love each other. Okay, so this is possibly one traditional view, that sex is related to intimacy and love. It's not something that you just, it's not like going out and getting a coffee or a beer with someone, if your friend. Okay, so she says this conception of the relationship between love and sex can be attacked in two ways. One is that we might divorce sex from love and regard sex as a pleasurable activity in its own right, comparable to the enjoyment of a good meal. So if you can go out and get a good meal with someone, why can't you go out and have sex with them? Sex is just this pleasurable thing. We should divorce love. Love is this entirely separate thing. Not implausible, although you can attack it from the other side as well. She says, alternatively, one might acknowledge the connection between sex and love, but attack the assumption of exclusivity, right? So you can either deny the connection between sex and love, or you can say, yes, sex is intimately related to love, but there's no reason that love has to be related to exclusivity, right? Parents can love multiple children. There's no threat. It's not like when you have a new child, you stop loving your old one. And it's not like if you make a new friend, you stop loving your old friends, right? So why the connection between exclusivity? Why should it be impossible to have more than one sexual partner, meaning more than one love relationship at a time? All right. But she does conclude that exclusivity seems to be an intrinsic part of our conception of true love, right? She says, imagine Romeo pouring his heart out to both Juliet and Rosalind. In our ideal of romantic love, one chooses to forgo pleasure with other partners in order to have a unique relationship with one's beloved. Such renunciation is natural in the first throes of romantic love. It's precisely because this stage does not last that we must promise to be faithful to the notoriously unromantic realities of love. So she concludes that this notion of exclusivity does kind of make sense if you're pursuing this idea of true love. So what she says is that an open marriage isn't morally wrong, but it simply deviates from this traditional ideal. Genuinely open marriages, she says, are not immoral, they just deviate from a valued ideal of what a marriage should be. And while this is not the only ideal or incumbent on all rational agents, it is a moral view that embodies a claim about a good way for people to live. The prohibition against adultery is neither arbitrary nor irrational. So she doesn't say that the prohibition against adultery is irrational or merely arbitrary, but she also doesn't say it's a moral obligation upon everyone. So she's essentially leaving it open for individuals to choose how they want to pursue a good life, right? So, and she does also conclude by saying that she doesn't see any moral value in remaining faithful in a marriage which is essentially miserable. Her exact words, "I cannot see much of any moral value in remaining physically faithful on principle to a spouse one no longer loves. This will displease those who regard the wrongness of adultery as a moral absolute, but my account has nothing to do with absolutes and everything to do with what it means to love someone deeply and completely. It is the value of that sort of relationship that makes sexual fidelity an ideal worth the sacrifice." So I think we get an interesting perspective on this issue of monogamy from Bonnie Steinbock. She's not arguing that it's morally wrong or that it's arbitrary or stupid, but she is saying that it's not the only good way to live, and that individuals should pursue their conception of a good life in a way that makes sense to them. And she does suggest that monogamy simply for the sake of monogamy, even if you're miserable, if you don't love the person, that does not make sense, which is different than the traditional moral ideal. But she's basing her arguments on what it means to love someone and ideal based on what brings people happiness and things like that, sort of rational concerns rather than a traditional sticking with tradition or religious values regarding monogamy and marriage. Anyhow, very interesting question. I think institution of marriage is something that has been very fluid throughout history. The most common sort of form of marriage was polygamy throughout most of history, and ideas regarding marriage and monogamy and love have changed very much throughout history, and they've changed a lot in Western culture. In the United States, say the past 50 years, when divorce has become very common, and I think they're going to continue to evolve, and it will be interesting to see where that goes.